That concludes the business, and we move on to the main business of the day. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Industry and Exports Bill, Industry and Exports Financial Assistance Bill, Committee.
Order. Under the orders of the House of the 15th of December, we shall now move to the Committee of the whole House. Order.
Industry and Exports Financial Assistance Bill.
I remind members that in committee, members should not address the Chair as Deputy Speaker. Please use our names when addressing the Chair. Madam Chair, Chair and Madam Chairman are also acceptable. We begin with Clause 1, Stand Part, with which it will be convenient to consider the amendments. Clauses stand part and new clauses on the selection paper. The question is that Clause 1 stand part of the bill. I call the Minister.
Madam Chair, it's good to see you in your place, and I welcome all members to the committee. This is a slightly unusual committee in that normally when we're a committee of the whole House it's awfully contentious and everybody's shouting at each other, but it's not so contentious this afternoon, certainly the main body of the bill itself. So I'm just going to introduce the elements of the bill that as published, and then at the end of the debate I'll respond to the debate and the amendments that several honourable members have tabled. So just to explain, Clause 1A increases the aggregate limit of financial assistance which can be provided under Section 8(1) of the Industrial Development Act 1982 from £12 billion to £20 billion. This is to reflect inflation adjustments since the limit was last raised in 2009. Clause 1B raises the level of incremental increases that can be made in an order by the Secretary of State from £1 billion to £1.5 billion. This again reflects inflation adjustments since the limit was last raised in 2009. The parliamentary scrutiny arrangements for these incremental increases remain precisely as they were, namely they are subject to the affirmative legislative procedure. Clause 2 amends the financial assistance for exports and overseas investment under the Export and Investment Guarantees Act 1991, and this brings in 4 changes to the Act. It raises the commitment limit from £84 billion to £160 billion. It simplifies the legislation by expressing the limit in sterling rather than in special drawing rights, as is currently the case. It makes provision for the limit to be increased by increments of up to £15 billion through secondary legislation as the need arises, and it removes the limit on the number of occasions on which the limit can be raised. Clause 3 of the bill outlines the territorial extent of the bill. I can confirm that the provisions of the bill do not engage the legislative consent motion process. My department have had discussions prior to introduction on this bill with all the devolved governments, and they confirm that the legislative consent motion process is not engaged. I hope, Madam Chair, that all honourable members will agree that all these clauses, all 3 of these clauses, should stand part of the bill, and I look forward to hearing the debate on the amendments. I was about to step down, I'm afraid, so I've finished.
I call Shadow Minister Dame Harriett Baldwin.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And it is a short bill, but it does raise and spend potentially a huge amount of public money. So in the interest of thorough scrutiny of this short bill, I would like to speak to the amendments that we have tabled to it. To Clause 2 on export finance, Amendments 3 and 4, they concern the use of public finance for exports that may ultimately be re-exported to sanctioned destinations. And what these amendments would prevent is the government providing export finance or insurance where there's reason to believe that goods may be re-exported to Russia or to any other country subject to UK sanctions. In such cases, the Secretary of State's financial commitments would be capped at 0. And these amendments are not abstract, Madam Chair. They respond to a very real problem that is happening in our world today, one that has been highlighted by independent analysis. For example, Sky's Ed Conway has done extensive reporting showing that while direct UK exports to Russia have collapsed since sanctions were imposed, UK origin goods are still reaching Russia through third countries. Exports to states such as Kyrgyzstan, Armenia and Uzbekistan have surged by extraordinary amounts, sometimes by more than 1,000%. And obviously, these are not normal market movements. They're clear indications of diversion routes being used to circumvent sanctions. These are not just trade flows on a spreadsheet, Madam Chair. Sky News has shown that UK origin components have been found inside Russian military equipment used on the battlefield in Ukraine. Among the items identified in Russian systems are British-made microchips found in Russian drones, UK-origin electronic components inside Russian missiles, dual-use technology that should never have been able to reach Russia under the sanctions regime. And these components were not exported directly from the UK to Russia. They were routed through intermediary countries, often the same countries where UK exports have suddenly spiked. President Zelensky has publicly raised concerns that UK goods are still making their way into Russia despite sanctions. And that's why we believe that Amendments 3 and 4 are necessary. They represent a simple but important safeguard. The UK must ensure that its export finance system doesn't inadvertently support supply chains that undermine our sanctions regime. In the case of Russia, we must be absolutely certain that no UK-backed goods are being diverted in ways that could support its illegal war against Ukraine. Now, the Minister has spoken about the need to expand UK export finances capacity and to support small and medium-sized enterprises in particular. We agree that export finance has an important role to play, but it must be deployed responsibly. I'm sure the whole House would agree that public money should never be used in ways that conflict with our foreign policy or national security objectives. And so these amendments ensure that the government exercises due diligence and that UK export finance support is aligned with the UK's sanction framework. So I'm sure the Minister will agree that this is a constructive and proportionate proposal and will want to support it tonight. Turning, if I may, Madam Chair, to the new Clause 2 tabled in the name of His Majesty's opposition, this is about the steel industry, because we can all agree that steel made in the UK is a strategic foundation sector for the United Kingdom. It supports thousands of skilled jobs and underpins supply chains across manufacturing, construction and defence. We did not oppose the government's emergency legislation last April, although we warned that it was rushed and the government hadn't got a proper plan. But after nearly a year on from that emergency legislation and nearly 2 years into this government, we are still waiting for the long-promised steel strategy. The government has still not been able to agree a deal with the Chinese, despite the Prime Minister's visit to China. There have been secret meetings after secret meetings between ministers and Jingyi about which the government has refused to update Parliament. So new Clause 2 would simply require the Secretary of State to publish an annual report on the impact of the increased financial assistance limits on the UK steel industry. That report would set out, first, the level of financial assistance provided each month to UK steel undertakings under Section 8 of the Industrial Development Act of 1982, and second, the number of full-time equivalent steel jobs that, in the Secretary of State's view, would have been lost without the increased limit. It's a straightforward accountability measure, Madam Chair. If public money is being used to support the steel sector, Parliament and the public deserve to know how much is being spent, why it's necessary, and what outcomes it's delivering. The government has repeatedly spoken about the importance of steel, and we agree that steel is very important, but without a clear strategy or transparent reporting, it's impossible to judge whether interventions are effective or whether they represent value for money. How do we know that this is not just a limitless amount of funding, crowding out support to other industries? And how can we assess whether it's good value for the taxpayer? So our amendment doesn't constrain the government's ability to act. It simply ensures that support is justified, targeted and effective. And in that spirit, Madam Chair, I hope the Minister will recognise the value of this additional transparency and accept the amendment. If I may, Madam Chair, may I turn to the amendments tabled in the name of my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green. We believe that amendments 1 and 2 are sensible and straightforward amendments, and if the Secretary of State has reason to believe that modern slavery or human trafficking is likely to be present in the supply chain of a business receiving export-supported goods, then obviously the level of public financial support should be zero. That is surely the only responsible position that this House can take. We're inherently supportive of the need for transparency in supply chains and will support these amendments as well. And turning to the amendment in the name of the Honourable Gentleman from North Antrim, again, transparency in terms of the amounts that are being allocated across the whole United Kingdom seems a helpful assistance in terms of transparency to this House. And on that point, I give way.
Can I commend the Shadow Minister for what she said and for bringing it forward? And in relation to Northern Ireland in particular, the Minister referred to the discussions and contact with the regional administrations. The UK Export Finance and Industrial Support has previously helped a number of companies in Northern Ireland to the tune of maybe some hundreds of millions in guarantees for international sales. Rightbus would be one of those. We in Northern Ireland, and those of us who will make contributions will state this, we are of the opinion that the adherence to EU rules. Does the Shadow Minister not agree that this needs to be clarified, the transparency the Honourable Lady has referred to, so the EU cannot continue to dictate terms for this nation through the back door of Northern Ireland? Does the Shadow Minister agree that's very, very important, and that the Minister and Government must respond to that?
Well, the honourable member makes a very important point, and I know that the House will be eager to hear how enthusiastic the Minister is for all of the amendments that have been tabled this evening, and I'm sure we will be hearing from him shortly in terms of his support for them, or potentially why he doesn't support them, and why he will be urging his colleagues to vote against them this evening.
Alex Ballinger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's always a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I welcome the bill and the more broadly the Labour government's focus on our modern industrial strategy. In the Black Country, where manufacturing is our tradition, businesses are following this agenda very closely. And so I'm pleased to see the bill will result in increasing headroom for both industrial financial assistance and UK export finance. However, I have 3 questions for the Minister on practical points for SMEs' access to finance in this bill. First, access to trade finance for SMEs. In Halesowen and Cradley Heath, I speak to firms that can win export work on quality and reputation, but who lose contracts because they cannot bridge the working capital gap between buying inputs and getting paid. A forge may secure promising overseas order only to be asked by their bank for levels of security that are simply unrealistic for a business of that size. And by the time finance is arranged, the customer may have gone elsewhere. So while I welcome the increased capacity in Clause 2, I'd like reassurance from the Minister that UK Export Finance will translate that headroom into products that genuinely work for SMEs, faster, simpler and more proportionate to their requirements. Second, I wanted to speak up for downstream steel SMEs. In my constituency, we have several steel processing firms, including firms like Davro Steel, who take steel and add value through processing and distribution, supplying manufacturers who depend on reliable specifications, timings and price stability. These businesses, however, are anxious about the direction of travel on steel tariff safeguards and quotas, because measures that protect larger players in the sector can, if designed poorly, raise input costs or restrict supply for downstream SMEs. So I hope the Minister can reassure the House that he will look at the whole value chain, not just the headline producers, when it deploys the increased assistance enabled by Clause 1. And thirdly, on the defence supply chain, the Black Country has deep links into defence manufacturing, and here two issues may impact the positive changes in the bill. The first is export licensing timelines, where excessive delays can kill a contract, and the second is the growing concern about ESG-related access to finance. These are practical problems when a legitimate UK defence supplier struggles to access competitively priced finance because lenders' policies treat defence as reputationally high risk. So I'd ask the Government to ensure that our regulatory architecture does not accidentally penalise lawful strategically important business industries in the defence sector. To close, I support the bill. I support the intent behind clauses 1 and 2 to create headroom so the Government can act to support manufacturers and exporters, but I will ask the Minister for reassurance on 3 points. That SMEs will be able to access trade finance in practice, that downstream steel processors and manufacturers will not be overlooked in favour of larger players, and that defence exporters will see improvements in licensing speed and fair access to finance.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Joshua Reynolds.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Liberal Democrats support this bill, and we support the amendments that are before committee today. The bill does something that's straightforward and it's necessary. It raises the Industrial Development Act cap from 12 to 20 billion, reflecting the inflation changes that since alignment was last set in 2009, and it nearly doubles the UK export finance commitment limit from 84 to around 160 billion. These changes, both UK industrial assistance and export finance framework, would hit their ceilings if we didn't make these changes. So these changes are really important to make. We support this bill because British businesses need government's backing to compete globally, and these limits need to keep pace with our ambition. The amendments before us strengthen the bill in a few distinct ways. Amendments 1 and 2 ensure that government-backed export finance cannot be used to support businesses whose supply chains involve modern slavery or human trafficking. It's a straightforward, ethical line. British taxpayers should not be underwriting exploitation, and we as Liberal Democrats are glad to support these amendments. I would ask the Minister to confirm what existing safeguards are in place and whether implementation guidance will be issued so that businesses know where they stand. Amendments 3 and 4 address the risk that UK export finance could facilitate sanctions evasion through re-exporting. As we raise the statutory limit to 160 billion, Parliament must be satisfied that none of this expanded headroom can be used in a way that undermines our sanctions regime, and therefore we support these amendments. New Clause 1, requiring annual reports on the Act's limits limit changes to each of the 4 nations. Although export finance is a reserved matter, outcomes are not necessarily evenly distributed, but a report into this will help give the scrutiny to Parliament about whether this expanded capacity is reaching every single part of the United Kingdom, and therefore, of course, we support it. And New Clause 2, requiring annual reports specifically into the steel industry. Steel is a profound strategic importance to the UK, and it deserves the dedicated parliamentary scrutiny that New Clause 2 suggests, and therefore we'll be supporting it. New Clause 3, that stands in my name, would require the Secretary of State to report on the annual impact of the Act's limits on GDP, on the export capacity of small and medium enterprises, and on the volume of trade between the United Kingdom and the European Union. UKEF's 24 to 25 activity contributed to 5.4 billion to the UK economy. Parliament should be able to verify that claim on an annual basis. According to the ONS, there are 5.7 million SMEs in the UK. Yet, in UK Export Finance's annual reports, it shows that they supported just 667 businesses. Annual reporting will hold the government to its own target of supporting an additional 1,000 SMEs to export. It will make visible whether the current eligibility criteria, which requires at least 20% of a business's annual turnover to be from exports in any one of the last 3 years, continue to lock out businesses that are trying to break into the export market for the first time or not. On the UK-EU trade part of New Clause 3, the Chartered Institute for Export and International Trade has documented a 30% fall in EU export value among the smallest firms since the TCA. And a recent Institute of Directors Policy Voice survey found that 54% of businesses that stopped exporting to the EU cited the trading relationship with the EU as one of those reasons. These are not businesses that are failing to break into new markets. These are established exporters that have walked away from our largest and nearest trading partner because the barriers that have got in their way are too great to bear. Every customs declaration, every check that didn't exist before 2021 is another reason that businesses are not exporting to the EU, because it simply isn't worth it for them. Those are the realities behind the statistics that simply increasing the UKEF capacity alone cannot fix. Parliament should be able to see whether an expanded UK export finance capacity is making measurable difference to these figures, and therefore we hope that the Minister will be able to support the new Clause 3 amendment. The most effective long-term support for British exporters would, of course, be a new bespoke UK-EU customs union. Analysis from Frontier Economics commissioned by Best for Britain in February 25 suggested it could boost British GDP by 2.2%, and the House of Commons Library estimates this could generate an additional £25 billion in additional annual tax revenue for HMRC, something I know the Chancellor would be grateful for. New Clause 3 is the link between the accountability mechanism that allows Parliament to see whether what is being proposed is working. So we will be supporting this bill. We will be supporting the amendments to this bill, because capacity without accessibility is just meaningless, and capacity without accountability is unacceptable. So the government needs to accept the new clauses that match the expanded headroom with the practical reforms to ensure that it will reach the 5.7 million SMEs, which are the backbone of British business, that are currently not being supported by UK export finance.
I call Mary Rimmer.
Well, I stand to speak in support of the Amendment 1, which the Honourable Member from Chingford and Woodford Green, it's in his name, and I've supported that. And it's narrow, this bill. It gives us an opportunity. Thanks to the work of this House, public bodies like the Department of Health and Social Care are legally required to eradicate slavery in their supply chains under the Health and Safety Care Act 2022 and Health and Social Care Act Regulations 2025. And we strengthened the safeguards to public money free from forced labour in last year's Great British Energy Act 2025. A little bit of fuss went on around that time. But no slavery on human trafficking is present in any part of the GBE's, Great British Energy's, supply chain. Yet UK export finance still lacks these protections. It's an inconsistency, but this amendment can fix it. If we are increasing the financial limits available to UK export finance, we should ensure that British support for business abroad is never tied to exploitation. It gives us a much bigger thing. It puts it across government in everything. When we got to British Energy, we tried something on that, and then I was told that I was right. It wouldn't have done it in British Energy. It went to the Lords, and it came back pretty quick. So I do thank the member for putting the amendment in.
Sir Iain Duncan-Smith.
Madam Chair, it's a great honour to speak to this packed chamber on my amendments.
Great honour.
It's good of me to be brought forward so soon because there's so many people ready to speak. Can I say that I speak in support of the two amendments in my name and those of my colleagues and friends, 1 and 2, which it's my intention that should be moved when the time comes. So, why is this necessary? Well, in this particular area, I refer to the Honourable Lady as my honourable friend, because she has been stalwart in campaigning against slave labour, against forced labour, and I bow to her because of her stalwart support of this. And the point about these amendments particularly are that it's really vital, as she said, to safeguard the UK export finance is legally protected from any exposure to forced labour and human trafficking. We've been through this so often, again and again, and I say to the right honourable gentleman who will be responding, who has been a stalwart supporter of this kind of drive, I just hope that he's able to give me a very clear sign that the government wants to adopt these amendments, because they are critical to the nature of cleaning up what essentially has become a supply chain which is too often full of product made by slave labour. So I'm in favour of the bill. I'm not against it. In principle, I think it's the right thing to do to basically up the limits to 20 billion and aggregate limits to 160. To account for inflation, we must ensure, therefore, absolutely right, that we increase financial firepower is not used, however, inadvertently to fund modern slavery. So Amendments A and B together ensure that the Secretary of State has reason to believe modern slavery is present in a recipient supply chain. The permitted financial assistance for that export drops to zero. In other words, no finance. And for those that may not have followed what's been going on with these things, we had to amend the original healthcare bill to stop slavery being used in that. And we've had to amend, last year, as the Honourable Lady said, we've had to amend the Great British Energy Bill. Now, the government at that time decided to vote that down. But when it went to the Lords, it was re-amended, and suddenly many colleagues on that side suddenly realised actually what they were going to be asked to do was to vote in favour of slave labour in the supply chains to the Great British Energy Company. And they said no, and I think the government decided not, which was absolutely right to do in the end, but I wish we hadn't had to go through all of that. Surely there's a moral purpose in all of this, which is if we have any suspicion that something is a product or a supply chain has elements that have been used for forced labour. We know that China does it endlessly. There are elements of that in Russia and other countries that use that. We should not allow that to come. And I have to say, when we compare ourselves to the United States on this, no matter who's in power, the reality is their governments have a very simple rule, that it is the responsibility of the companies who are actually importing to check their supply chains. The excuse that they didn't know or couldn't find out is simply not good enough, and they are prosecuted if that slave labour is in the supply chain. And that's what this is really all about, just trying to shut down another possible loophole, in this case on finance. And so UK expert finance is currently exposed, we believe, to forced labour. For instance, in 2022-23, it supported businesses involving a subsidiary of AVIC, a company sanctioned by the US as a People's Liberation Army entity. And this is something which nobody wants, I think, on either side of the House, if they really ask themselves, and the government, I'm sure, does not want this. So the question really is, how do we shut this down? And I want to quote a couple of people who have spoken about this in the past, who are really quite senior in the government. So the Prime Minister said, and I want to quote this, "We're not going to raise human rights standards if we ignore it in trade. It shouldn't be up to the consumer to research every product and work out every ethical aspect of it." And I say yes, because, of course, it's impossible to do so as an individual. I had the row with Amazon and other companies and said, why don't you make it easy to find out what the route in your supply chain is? You don't know until you actually have the product land on your desk, where it was made. Why can't they have it on their computers and identify that? They don't want to because they think people may not buy those products. The other one is from TradeSec. Well, while he was TradeSec, we are very clear on our position regarding the abhorrent practices of modern slavery. It's a terrible crime which we are determined to eradicate. I assure you this government takes this issue seriously and is continuing to assess and monitor the policy tools available to ensure that we can best tackle forced labour in supply chains, said in May 25 by Mr Reynolds MP. And Ed Miliband, I should say the Environment Secretary, this is a quote, "Our clean power mission should not come at the expense of human rights. This involves confronting human rights abuses, including modern slavery in energy supply chains." Absolutely right. I don't simply understand why it took so much for us to get his side of the fence to agree finally to take it out of the supply chains for the Great British Energy Company. I just don't understand that at all, given what he says his views are. And UKIP has also supported China Southern Airlines, an organisation affiliated with involuntary labour transfers, and I quote, poverty alleviation, which of course is a complete sham. Campaigns in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Successive governments have acknowledged that the poverty alleviation is a euphemism for involuntary state-imposed labour. We know that. There's no question about what's going on behind these ridiculous euphemisms, and that's what we know, and we should therefore be ensuring doesn't happen. But it has happened. and we currently have an uneven human rights standard across government. While the Department of Health and Social Care is now required by law, as I said earlier on, to eradicate slavery from its purchasing, other departments which are currently exposed to complicity in the human rights are not required to satisfy these standards. UKEF is a case in point. I simply beg the government at some stage to get back into the Modern Slavery Act and amend it so that we make it outright and a criminal offence for anybody to import or to support any product made, any company that makes products using slave labour. That would kill this off once and for all and would cover all elements of government activity, which I know the Minister who will respond to this actually does believe in. And so I simply say to him, why doesn't the government just simply say, enough's enough, we're going to get after it? And we'll come back to that, I'm sure, when he sums up on this. So this amendment mirrors the high standards set in the Great British Energy Act, which we, as the Honourable Lady pointed out, which we finally got the amendment agreed to. And it mandates very clearly that no slavery or human trafficking be present in any part of its supply chain. And by allowing public money to flow to entities sanctioned by our allies, we risk disrupting multilateral relations and creating significant operational risks for British businesses. I also say simply to those that are interested in listening to this, that the reality is we also do down our own competitiveness. It is no surprise, it should be no surprise to us, that countries like China are able to outbid British companies and Western companies in bid patterns, etc., like Huawei, when we discover later on that they use a significant amount of slave-made product where they don't pay any salaries to them and where therefore they're able to keep their costs much lower than British companies, Western companies, European companies, even American companies, because we are obligated, quite rightly, to pay proper wages to those who are making the products. So it's also a terrible offence in trade terms, not just in human rights terms. And so while the UKEF maintains its own internal environmental and human rights policies, they have already been proven inadequate for this task, inadequate in preventing investment in companies seriously exposed to human rights abuses, of which this is the worst of them all. And the bill presents a rare and necessary opportunity, I say to the Minister, to use primary legislation to bind UK outward investment to a zero-tolerance approach towards modern slavery. The government, I'm sure, I hope not, but I'm sure, will say that this bill is narrow, that this is not the right bill, not the right time. I'm afraid we've always heard this. When I was on the other side and the government used to speak at the same time, I used to say to them, there never is the right time and there never is the right bill. There's just the wrong one that's sitting in here for you to amend it. So we've heard this repeatedly, and all the reforms to the Modern Slavery Act would be brought forward, quotes, when parliamentary time is allowed. That's what the government said. When parliamentary time is allowed, as I said earlier on, we should get the Modern Slavery Act updated so that it is absolutely an offence to have any involvement whatsoever, either importing, export or financing any of that trade that has slave labour involved in it. But none of this has been brought forward. We have an opportunity, though, with this bill, and so I do not apologise for these amendments. Narrowly focused it may be on an institution, though now, which these amendments will do, focus making mistakes in the past, which we have evidence of, funneling UK tax monies into pockets of human rights abusing companies in China. This surely must stop. So if we're going to bring this element of financing up to date, we're going to give the power and the capacity to be able to support those who are exporting and importing, then the answer is we must also make sure that they do that in a fair and clean way, and that this house of all houses, when this was the first country to abolish slavery in the world history, we were the first to do it, and our record should stand, therefore, that wherever we seek it, wherever we see it, we will stamp it out. And this is yet another way of doing that. So I urge the Minister to go off script and say that he will do this because it is morally right, it is economically right, and it is right for this House and the people that here elected here to get this one done.
Jim Allister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Looking at this bill, one would make the natural assumption that since it applies across this United Kingdom, that it must bring a level playing field to this United Kingdom, that it must in consequence deliver parity and equality of opportunity for companies across the United Kingdom, companies which of course are all taxed on the same basis, pay into the same treasury. So the reasonable expectation would be that if there is financial assistance available and they qualify, that they should equally be able to obtain it. Sadly, though you wouldn't know it from reading this bill, it is not so, because this bill is subject to a higher authority in respect of my constituency and of the whole of Northern Ireland, in that, sadly, we remain subject to EU state aid rules, which cap the delivery of that parity and that equal opportunity to companies operating in my part of the United Kingdom. And of course, that imposition of the EU state aid rules arises from Article 10 of the protocol, now called the Windsor Framework, which the EU has accurately described in these terms. This means that EU state aid rules will continue to apply to the EU member states as well as to the United Kingdom in respect of aid that has an effect on the trade between Northern Ireland and the European Union that is subject to the Windsor Framework. It follows from these provisions of the Windsor Framework, and in particular its Articles 5 and 9, that trade in goods and wholesale electricity is subject to the Windsor Framework. And being subject to the Windsor Framework means that under Article 10 we are subject not to the rules of this House on state aid, but to the rules of a foreign jurisdiction which makes rules and laws that we neither make nor can we change. And therein lies the fundamental objection to the fact that though we are passing a bill which rightly raises the thresholds of available assistance in Northern Ireland, this House is not sovereign in that regard. They can only grant that state aid to the point and the level that the EU permits under its EU state aid rules. Now, we're supposed to be... Yes, I'll give one.
Does he accept that the situation is even worse than that? Because if there's a tenuous connection between goods which are subsidised or get state aid in GB, but have got a tenuous connection with markets in Northern Ireland, that again the EU can limit the amount of state aid which is given in those circumstances, so again even disadvantaging some producers here in GB?
Yes, that's absolutely right, because the Windsor Framework is premised upon an assumption of risk that goods from Northern Ireland will permeate the EU market, and therefore goods which are supplied from GB companies into Northern Ireland are subject to that risk. And if that risk is manifested, then those companies too, it would appear, are subject or could be subject to the same state aid restrictions. And yet we're supposed to be one sovereign United Kingdom. But the EU requires that businesses in Northern Ireland will not benefit from the same state aid to the extent that the goods in question might be sold into the EU. And that inevitably places businesses in my constituency, which pay the same taxes as businesses across the United Kingdom, puts them at a distinct disadvantage compared to what in some cases might be competitors in GB in the production of goods. And it's even worse for Northern Ireland companies, particularly manufacturing companies, because they depend, as part of the integrated United Kingdom market, They depend for their supplies, their raw materials, more often than not, from that supplied from GB. And of course, those raw materials, the supply of them is now fettered by the Irish border. To get their raw materials, they have to pass through an international customs border with paperwork, with declarations, with tariffs in some cases, all adding to the cost of business. So not only is business subject to that extra cost insisted upon through the Irish border, but they're now put in a position where they cannot have equal access to the state aid which might be available elsewhere. And that is a fundamental inequity as it applies across this United Kingdom. And it is further compounded by the fact that if there is a dispute about whether or not something amounts to state aid and whether or not it infringes EU state aid rules, it's not our courts that decide that. It's the European Court of Justice that will decide that. So not only are we deprived within the supposedly sovereign United Kingdom of the right to grant equal state aid across this United Kingdom, if there's a question as to its validity, it's a foreign court that adjudicates upon that because of our subjection to EU law. So it really is a double whammy in that regard. And of course, the consequence of that is inevitably to create a chill factor when it comes to government considering whether or not to give state aid to Northern Ireland. Because if they know that there could be a challenge from the EU, and that challenge could go to the European Court of Justice and all the bother that that involves, the chill factor is going to cause the government to desist or hold back from giving that aid. So the loser, again, is the business in Northern Ireland. Yes, a good point.
And would he accept that there's a further chill factor, namely when companies which could decide to invest in GB or invest in Northern Ireland may well feel that since the support which they could achieve will be less in Northern Ireland than what it would be in GB, that they simply choose to invest outside Northern Ireland in GB, and therefore jobs and investment opportunities are lost as a result of the very picture that he has painted.
Of course, and that's compounded further by the fact that if they did set up in Northern Ireland and they were a manufacturing business and they were depending on the raw materials from GB, as most are, they have to pass through an international customs border with extra costs as well. So not only are they being invited to set up in Northern Ireland where state aid may be capped by a foreign jurisdiction, but they're also being invited to set up in a jurisdiction where the raw materials are going to cost them more by virtue of the Irish Sea border. Now, of course, the Minister will say, as he said to me before, but you have the advantage of dual market access. No, we don't. We have the worst of all worlds in Northern Ireland. We have the worst of all worlds in the sense our raw materials are hyped in price because of the Irish Sea border. We now have the reduction in available state aid.
I am sure that the honourable gentleman is minded of the bill that we are discussing and will soon get back to the bill that we are discussing. Jim Allister. Straight away.
Well, indeed I will, but it was in fact in the debate on this bill that the Minister made the very point that I was seeking to answer on a previous occasion. But it is those circumstances which caused me to support and move new clause 1, signed by myself and right honourable colleagues, because I think it is right going forward, not just in the interest of transparency, but in the interest of seeing just how level or unlevel a playing field we have under this bill for the whole United Kingdom, that the government should annually publish the levels of support given to each part of the United Kingdom. Because, yes, we're all here as constituency members to jealously represent the interests of our constituents. And I want to know from this government, if my constituents, if the businesses in my constituency are getting a fair crack of the whip. And that is why new Clause 1 is the reason why we should have a reporting mechanism to indicate that to us going forward. So on that basis, I very much speak to and support new Clause 1. I also support the other amendments before the House.
Carla Lockhart.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's an honour to follow the Honourable Member for North Antrim, and I stand to speak in support of NC1 in the name of the Honourable Member and signed by numerous people across these benches. New Clause 1 is not radical, it's not wrecking, it is actually very reasonable in what it asks, and therefore it should be accepted. What it asks is that when this House votes to increase financial assistance for industry and exporters, the Government return within a year and every year thereafter and tell Parliament plainly how each part of the United Kingdom has benefited. That should not in any way be controversial, but sadly it is necessary because Northern Ireland does not stand on equal ground. This bill lifts the cap on financial assistance under the Industrial Development Act and increases UK Export Finance's statutory commitment limit, and that's a good thing. And in theory, that should benefit every business across our country. But under Article 10 of the Windsor Framework, EU state aid rules continue to apply in Northern Ireland, where support may affect trade in goods within the European Union. So while the rest of the United Kingdom moves forward under one subsidy regime, Northern Ireland operates under a different legal shadow. The practical effects is hesitation in departments, hesitation in advice, hesitation in investment, because the final interpretation does not rest with the UK courts alone. That is not equality within the Union, and we cannot view this in isolation from the wider damage already being inflicted in Northern Ireland by the Protocol and the Windsor Framework. I've said it before in this House that the Protocol and Windsor Framework is not a minor technical adjustment to trade. It is a bureaucratic burden, a constitutional compromise and an economic noose around the businesses simply trading within our own internal market. And we see it evidenced here today in this bill when it doesn't apply to Northern Ireland. The failure is not anecdotal, it is measurable, it is documented and deeply felt. The Federation of Small Businesses has reported that 58% of businesses in Northern Ireland face moderate to significant challenges because of these arrangements. More than 1/3 have stopped trading with Great Britain altogether to avoid the cost and complexity. Let the reality of that sink in. That's not frictionless trade. That's not the best of both worlds. That is economic distortion inside our own country. I've spoken about the businesses that have had essential goods delayed from Scotland, costing time and money. I have raised the case of used agriculture machinery refused entry unless it meets EU standards, despite them being road-driven and clean. I've heard from retailers struggling to source ordinary goods from their main market in Great Britain because of paperwork and regulatory barriers that simply do not exist anywhere else in the United Kingdom. This is the lived reality of the Irish Sea border, and we're told that all of this is necessary to protect the Belfast Agreement. It's not. The agreement is built on consent. The principle that Northern Ireland's place within the United Kingdom cannot change without consent of its people. Yet our economic and legal position has been fundamentally altered without that consent. The agreement does not require an internal border within our sovereign state. It does not require that one part of the United Kingdom be subject to distinct regulatory and subsidy regime overseen in part by a foreign court, the European Court of Justice. This bill increases state support for British industry, but unless we confront the consequences of the Windsor Framework, honestly, Northern Ireland will potentially not benefit in step with England, Scotland and Wales. New Clause 1 simply asks for transparency. If Northern Ireland is genuinely benefiting equally, let the government publish the evidence annually. But if it once again, Northern Ireland is constrained while the rest of the United Kingdom moves freely, then this House also deserves to know just that. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. Our businesses pay the same taxes. They deserve the same support without qualification, without hesitation and without constraint. So that is why I support new Clause 1 and my colleagues on these benches, and I commend the Honourable Member for North Antrim for bringing it before the House today. Thank you.
Minister to wind up.
Madam Chair, I note that the creative industries have now achieved 5% growth in the last year, faster than any other part of the economy, and I think we've seen quite a creative industry this evening manage to get amendments into this very tightly constricted bill, and I'm happy to address some of the issues that I think some of them strayed somewhat wide of the mark of the bill itself. Let me turn first of all to the amendments from my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Wood Green. He and I have participated in many campaigns on forced labour and other issues, and I am entirely with him on the aim of wanting to prevent all modern slavery. I would just correct him on one factual mistake that he made. He said that the UK was the first country to ban slavery. It was Haiti. You could argue that the French, because they did it in 1804, you could argue that Napoleon abolished it, but then they returned to slavery afterwards. But it was Haiti that was first. But he makes a very good point that modern slavery is an abomination. It is morally wrong. Forced labour is morally wrong. It's also a taint on any kind of international trade. It undermines fair practice from other countries that don't engage in forced labour, and I'm determined to do everything I possibly can, both in this role and if I'm not in this role in the future, to make sure that we tackle forced labour in every single part of the way we run our economy. As a Labour member, it would be shocking if I weren't to say precisely that. I would say to him, he knows that I'm not going to accept his amendment because false, fake shock doesn't suit him as a look. I do think it would be wrong for us in this country to feed ourselves, to clothe ourselves, to house ourselves on the back of forced labour. We are engaged at the moment in a review of responsible business conduct. I very much hope that that will move us in a direction of being able to tackle this in a comprehensive way, rather than just in this particular area. I do want to reassure him that UK Export Finance take these issues extremely seriously. They are very diligent in the way that they analyse and look at any of their investments that they make to make sure that environmental and human rights issues are fully addressed before they make any financial commitment. We do intend to produce our response to the Responsible Business Conduct Review very soon. I can't give a precise date, as ministers rarely don't manage to produce dates, as he knows. The UKEF uses OECD standards and equator principles. It also reports extensively on this, as it is required to do under the two acts which apply to it, and it works with the Office for Responsible Business Conduct's Disputes Resolution Unit, which provides a non-judicial grievance mechanism for looking at precisely all of these issues. So I'm not saying a long-term no to the request he's asking. I completely agree with the aim of what he's seeking to achieve. I think we already do that under UKEF, and if he's got particular issues that arise in the future, I hope he will write to me, and I'll be very happy to respond to him. Yes, of course.
And I understand what he's saying very clearly, but I will say that a couple of examples I gave where this had slipped through the net does show that this is not perfect. And the second bit which I would put to him is, then does he think the government is likely, therefore, to deliver on what they said they would do, which is to take the Modern-Day Slavery Act and beef it up in such an extent that those companies importing and exporting have the responsibility to check their supply trains? Other than that, it would be a criminal offence.
I can't say anything more clearly than that I want to make sure that we in the UK are not reliant for our economic prosperity on the forced labour of others. and we need to make that as comprehensive and as effective as we possibly can. I would just say to him, I know the 2 cases that he referred to, and if he wants, I'm happy to write to him about those in precise detail, rather than delay the House tonight. But I would just say that, funnily enough, the precise processes that we went through in the UK in relation to UKEF and those cases would have been met by the US legislation as well, which is arguably not as effective as it would like to be. So I'm interested in being effective in this space, as interested as him. I'll turn to the Honourable Member for North Antrim, who gave an exceptionally good speech on why we shouldn't have left the European Union, I thought. And why we should never have accepted the deal that was put on the table. And I note that the people of Northern Ireland agreed with me on that subject and didn't agree with him on whether the UK should leave the European Union. I'm afraid that, however, if you just allow me, I'll respond to the points that were made by him and by the Honourable Member for Upper Bann, which is, first of all, the requirements under the new clause, I think, are completely unnecessary because UKEF already reports annually, as required by legislation, all of which is cleared through the National Audit Office. It's all there, perfectly available for anybody to see. I got a sense that there was a suggestion that Northern Ireland was losing out because of the money from UKEF. Quite the reverse. I think if either of the honourable members want to go through what is already published in this sphere, then they can see for themselves precisely how well Northern Ireland does. And of course it should do, because we want to make the whole point of the 2 acts that we're referring to today is that they should be able to enable. I am going to give way to him if he just holds his horses for just a very brief moment. And of course I would make the point that 2 further points. First, that UKEF has offices across the whole of the United Kingdom, including in Northern Ireland. But I think there's a misunderstanding here, which is some people seem to suggest that what happens is that the government goes, give money to that business over there. That isn't what happens. What happens is that this is a demand-led process which leads to UKEF being able to respond to the demand that arises. We need to make sure that that is spread across the whole of the United Kingdom, and that's what we intend to do. Of course, I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Except that Northern Ireland would expect to do well out of this because proportionally we export much more of our industrial production than happens in other parts of the United Kingdom. And whilst he rails against the decision on Brexit, etc., does he accept that since the United Kingdom as a whole voted to leave the EU, the government's responsibility was to make sure that then the whole of the United Kingdom left on the same terms?
Well, I wasn't a member of the government and I didn't support the deal that he supported in the first place, which gave us some of the problems that we've got today. I want to make sure that all the businesses across the whole of the United Kingdom are able to export. I've made this point before, that it's just over 1 in 10 businesses in the UK export across around the world. If we could manage to double that, it would be very good. I think it's something like 16,000 UK businesses who used to export into the European Union no longer do so. I think that is an own goal, which is why we're trying to reset our relationship with the European Union so that we can do better on exports. I'll turn to the amendments from the Honourable Lady from Worcestershire. She was primarily aimed at money laundering and some of the issues that in relation to Russia. I want to make absolutely clear we are determined to do everything we possibly can to debilitate the Russian military complex. First of all, by making sure that it doesn't have the finances available to it because it is unable to trade in the rest of the world. And secondly, to make sure that it doesn't have the materiel, the kit that it needs to be able to conduct its war. And that's why the UK has implemented a comprehensive set of sanctions worth over £20 billion of UK-Russia trade. In the UK's next package of sanctions, we will introduce new sanctions on the direct and indirect export of goods from the UK to Russia, further tackling issues in chemicals, minerals and metals, which have been identified to have potential uses in Russia's military-industrial complex. We will target actors in Russia and third countries that support trade in Russian energy, including the shadow fleet vessels, refineries, terminals and their facilitators. And the Government has, since January 2025, regularly updated detailed guidance, has regularly updated detailed guidance for exporters of at-risk goods, including the kind of things that the Honourable Lady referred to, which I think she was taking from an article in the Times, which was repeated in the Telegraph, or the other way round, detailing specific products and third countries where Russia is focusing efforts to circumvent sanctions. Of course, they attempt to be wily, but we are determined to outfox them. This guidance goes further than any partner countries, providing a unique resource for UK exporters. And on the back of that, I would say to the Honourable Lady, of course she's right that we want to tackle any attempt at money laundering, but I think that her amendment, first of all, it confuses the role of UKEF with the issues in the article in the Times, and secondly, it would duplicate measures that are already adopted by UKEF on the back of the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002, the Terrorism Act of 2000 and the 2017 Treasury regulations. If I come to new clause 2, which relates to steel, I would say again, Madam Chair, that the reporting requirements are very clear for UKEF under existing legislation, and so the precise issues that are in relation to steel, which we are very intent on making sure that we have a proper strategy so as to protect the sector for our security interests and for the jobs that it represents across the whole of the UK. That is all very important, but I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding in the amendment of how UKEF functions. It is essentially demand-led, not determined by government centrally, except in very exceptional circumstances. And there's one other flaw in the amendment, which is that most of the major steel plants in the UK are in assisted areas. So financial assistance usually comes from Section 7 of the Industrial Development Act rather than Section 8, which is what is referred to in the amendment. My honourable friends, the members for Halesowen, asked me several questions just about which I'll refer briefly to. He asked me about support for SMEs in particular. UKEF supported 496 SMEs in 2024-25, thanks in part to changes which have made it easier for smaller businesses to access UKEF funding, financing, and I'm determined to make sure that that continues. In relation to new clause 3, reporting on GDP and SMEs, I think I've already made the point that although Oxford Economics research shows that 115,000 businesses were effectively supported by UKEF, nonetheless, all those reporting requirements that are in the amendments are already met in law. And consequently, Madam Chair, I hope that honourable members will not be supporting any of the amendments before us today.
The question is that Clause 1 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to Amendment 1 to Clause 2, which has been selected for separate decision. I call Sir Iain Duncan-Smith to move for Amendment 1 formally.
So moved formally.
The question is that Amendment 1 be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No! Division, clear the lobby. The question is as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Gregory Stafford, Rebecca Paul. Tellers for the noes, Mark Ferguson, Imogen Walker. Order.
The ayes to the right, 161. The noes to the left, 272.
The ayes to the right were 161. The noes to the left were 272. So the noes have it. The noes have it. Unlocked. With the leave of the House, I shall put together the questions that clauses 2 and 3 stand part of the bill. The question is that clauses 2 and 3 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. New clause 2 has been selected for a separate decision. Dame Harriett Baldwin to move new clause 2 formally.
Formally.
Impact of financial assistance limits on the steel industry.
The question is that new clause 2 be read a second time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no.
No!
Division, clear the lobby. Order. The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No! Tell us for the ayes, Gregory Stafford, Rebecca Paul. Tell us for the noes, Mark Ferguson, Imogen Walker.
order.
The ayes to the right were 156, the noes to the left 273.
The ayes to the right were 156, the noes to the left 273, so the noes have it, the noes have it. Unlock. New clause 3 has been selected for separate decision. Joshua Reynolds to move new clause 3 formally.
Impact of financial assistance limits number 2.
The question is that new clause 3 be read a second time. As many as of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No! Division. Clear the lobby. The question is that new clause 3 be read a second time. As many as of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. No! The tellers for the ayes are Charlotte Kane and Tessa Munt. The tellers for the noes, Mark Ferguson and Imogen Walker. Order, order.
The ayes to the right, 77. The noes to the left, 280.
The ayes to the right were 77, the noes to the left 280, so the noes have it, the noes have it. Unlock. Order, order. The question is that I do report the bill to the House. The question is that I do report the bill to the House. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Whip to report.
I beg to report that the committee has gone through the bill and directed me to report the same without amendment.
Third reading.
Now.
Minister to move third reading. Sir Chris Bryant.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank all honourable colleagues for their engagement on this bill and beg to move that the bill be read a third time. As you will know, Madam Deputy Speaker, Voltaire said that a small book is a great evil, but this small bill will do a great deal of good. It will ensure that the government can continue to support British industry and British exporters. £14.5 billion of UK export finance support last year is supporting up to 70,000 jobs, including across key industrial sectors like clean energy, advanced manufacturing, life sciences and automotives. And through existing provisions in the Industrial Development Act, the British Business Bank's Northern Powerhouse Investment Fund 2 has directly invested £115 million into over 300 small businesses. Similarly, in the Midlands Engine Investment Fund 2 has launched a £400 million fund to drive sustainable economic growth by supporting innovation and creating local opportunity for new and growing businesses. This bill ensures that the government can continue its investment into the British businesses that are the backbone of this economy. And I would like to thank the officials in my department, in particular James Copeland, Cal Stewart, Ellie Buck and Andrew Fernandez, and of course the whole of my private office who have helped me take this to this point. In tandem with our new trade strategy, more businesses than ever before will be empowered to export with the financial firepower of government behind them. And in combination with the modern industrial strategy, this government has ensured that the UK remains one of the strongest, most attractive and innovative economies in the world, both now and in the future. So it is with great pleasure that I commend this bill, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the House.
The question is that the bill be now read the third time. Shadow Minister Dame Harriett Baldwin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I sense that this is an occasion where the House would appreciate it if I were quite brief. I am grateful, though, to be able to set out our support for the principles of this bill. We will not be opposing third reading. It raises the statutory limits in a way that will enable the government to provide UK industry with additional support. And, of course, as His Majesty's official opposition, we want to see exports grow, investment increase and UK firms thrive. But we also believe that public money must be used responsibly, transparently and only where it's genuinely needed. And that's why we regret that the government opposed our amendments this evening. They didn't accept amendments, but we will continue to press for greater transparency around these very large sums of expenditure of public money. We will press for stronger safeguards and for a more coherent industrial strategy, particularly in the steel sector. We want to see British businesses succeed. We want exporters to have the support they need. We want public money to be used wisely and in the national interest. So while not opposing this bill today, we will continue to scrutinise the work of the department closely.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Joshua Reynolds.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Britain is a trading nation. When our businesses win contracts abroad, they create jobs, raise wages and generate tax revenues needed to fund our public services. And expanding UK export finance's capacity to 160 billion and raising the limit for industry development to 20 billion sends a clear signal that we are open for growth and want our exporters to compete globally. That matters for advanced manufacturing, that matters for life sciences, for clean technology, and for the thousands of smaller firms right across every constituency who have the ambition to sell to the world. We support this bill because that ambition deserves to be backed. I am disappointed that the government couldn't support the amendments that we brought forward, and of course I'm disappointed that they couldn't do that, because we've been asked today to approve near doubling of UKEF's statutory commitment limits without mechanisms we feel are required to verify whether these are working properly. UK Export Finance supported 667 businesses last year, and we are concerned that the eligibility criteria that UKEF have lock out firms trying to break into exporting for a first time, and this does remain unchanged. We also, of course, are concerned that the structural barriers that drive former exporters away from our largest export market in the European Union remain unaddressed. But we do support this bill because it's important that we move forward supporting those businesses that are exporting. But we are, as I say, concerned that we have missed an opportunity today to help support those British SMEs that want to go and start exporting, that used to export to the European Union but can't now, and we will monitor closely to make sure that this works in practice for all of those local SMEs.
The question is that the bill be now read the third time. As many as of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.